What if the most famous album in music history never hid a secret at all? What if the real trick was convincing the world that it did? For more than 50 years, The Dark Side of the Moon has been treated like a puzzle. Fans have searched for codes, hidden messages, secret meanings buried beneath the music. Some even believe the album was designed to sync perfectly with The Wizard of Oz, as if Pink Floyd had secretly created a cinematic soundtrack and never told anyone. And here's the strange part. The band never needed to confirm it, because once the idea took hold, the album did the rest on its own. From whispered voices to ticking clocks, from heartbeats to laughter, Dark Side feels like it's trying to tell you something without ever saying exactly what that something is. And that's where the illusion begins. This isn't a story about a hidden movie. It's not about secret instructions or cosmic coincidences. It's about how Pink Floyd created an album so carefully constructed that it trained the listener to search for meaning everywhere, even where none was placed. In other words, the world wasn't fooled by a message. It was fooled by the experience. And once you hear it that way, The Dark Side of the Moon never sounds the same again. Before we continue, if you love Pink Floyd's stories and want to keep their legacy alive, subscribe, like, and share. The myth begins with a simple instruction. Start The Dark Side of the Moon at the exact moment the lion roars during the MGM logo in The Wizard of Oz. Then sit back. Suddenly, strange things seem to happen. Music swells as Dorothy opens her door. Lyrics feel eerily aligned with moments of danger or wonder. Emotional shifts appear to match the film's rhythm. For many people, it feels impossible to ignore. The theory spread quietly at first, passed between fans, written about in magazines, shared in late-night conversations long before the internet amplified everything. By the 1990s, it had a name. And by then, it felt unstoppable. What made the idea so powerful wasn't just the coincidences. It was how convincing they felt. People didn't just notice one or two moments. They noticed dozens. Enough to believe this couldn't be accidental. And yet, there was a problem. Pink Floyd denied it. Openly. Repeatedly. Sometimes even mockingly. No plan. No intention. No connection to the film at all. And still, the myth refused to die. Because once people experienced the sync for themselves, logic stopped mattering. Something felt real. And that feeling was stronger than any explanation. But that wasn't the whole story. Because the Wizard of Oz theory only exists because The Dark Side of the Moon was already built to invite obsession. One reason The Dark Side of the Moon feels like it syncs with a film is simple. It almost never stops. The album flows continuously, with no hard breaks between tracks. Emotions bleed into each other, tension rises, releases, then rises again. There's no clear beginning, no obvious ending, just movement. That structure alone makes it unusually easy to overlay onto something else, especially a film built on emotional contrast. But there's more. The themes are universal. Fear, time, money, madness, hope, loss. These ideas aren't specific to one story. They apply to almost every story. So when music about anxiety plays over a scene of danger, the brain connects the dots automatically. Not because it was designed that way, but because the mind wants it to be true. Psychologists have a word for this. It's the tendency to see patterns where none were intentionally placed. And Dark Side feeds that instinct perfectly. Because it never explains itself. It doesn't guide the listener. It doesn't offer conclusions. Instead, it creates atmosphere. An atmosphere invites interpretation. That's why people can sync the album not just to The Wizard of Oz, but to other films, visuals, and experiences. The album doesn't match the story. It matches emotion. And emotion is the most flexible language there is. But the illusion doesn't stop there. Because Pink Floyd added something even more unsettling. They added voices. Throughout The Dark Side of the Moon, voices drift in and out of the music. They laugh. They whisper. They confess. They ramble. None of them are explained. These weren't scripted monologues or actors performing lines. They were real people, staff, friends, technicians, answering questions asked casually in the studio. Questions about fear, violence, death, pressure. Their answers were chopped up, rearranged, and layered into the music. Out of context. That's the key. Because when a human voice appears without explanation, the brain assumes meaning. It sounds like a clue, a confession, a message meant for someone paying close attention. But the album never tells you who is speaking or why. So listeners fill in the gaps themselves. Some hear warnings. Others hear philosophy. Others hear secrets hidden in plain sight. The voices feel intimate, almost intrusive, like you're overhearing something you weren't meant to hear. And once that feeling sets in, everything else starts to feel intentional. The clocks, the heartbeats, the silence between words. The album doesn't say it's hiding something. It lets you believe it is. And belief, once activated, is hard to turn off. The voices weren't the only thing doing the work. Underneath the music, the dark side of the moon is filled with sounds that don't behave like normal instruments. Heartbeats pulse beneath the opening, clocks explode into chaos, coins clatter, cash registers snap shut, laughter turns unsettling, screams vanish before they're explained. None of these sounds are decorative. They feel symbolic even when they aren't. A heartbeat immediately signals life and mortality. Clocks trigger anxiety about time slipping away. Money sounds evoke greed, pressure, and power. The brain reacts before logic has time to step in. That's the trick. The album constantly activates emotional responses without telling you why. There's no narrator explaining what each sound represents, no guidebook, no resolution. So the listener starts translating. Every noise feels intentional. Every transition feels meaningful. And once that mindset takes hold, coincidence becomes confirmation. That's why the album feels ritualistic, like something designed to be experienced, not just heard. People don't simply listen to Dark Side, they enter it. And when you're inside that atmosphere, it's easy to believe you're being led somewhere, that something is unfolding beneath the surface. But Pink Floyd never tells you what the sounds mean. They leave that work entirely to you. And that's exactly what makes the illusion so powerful. Because the more meaning you assign, the deeper the album appears. And just when you think you've decoded it, the album delivers its most famous line. At the very end of The Dark Side of the Moon, a calm voice breaks the silence. There is no dark side of the moon, really. Matter of fact, it's all dark. For millions of listeners, that line sounded like a conclusion, a philosophical statement, a final key that unlocked everything that came before it. People treated it like a revelation, a summary of the album's meaning, a hidden truth finally spoken out loud. But here's what almost no one questioned. That line wasn't written as a message. It was simply another piece of studio chatter, selected, edited, and placed at the end because it felt right. Nothing more. And yet, because it comes last, listeners assign it enormous weight. The album trains you to expect significance, so when that line arrives, it feels definitive, even if it isn't. That's how the illusion completes itself. A casual remark becomes prophecy. A fragment becomes philosophy. The meaning doesn't come from the band. It comes from the listener. And Pink Floyd never stepped in to correct that assumption. They let the world believe the album was speaking in riddles. Which brings us to the most important part of the story. Because the band did deny one thing, but they never explained the rest. When asked directly about the Wizard of Oz synchronization, Pink Floyd were clear. There was no plan, no hidden soundtrack, no secret intention. Roger Waters dismissed it outright. David Gilmour treated it with amused disbelief. But notice what they didn't do. They never broke down the album. They never explained the symbols. They never told people what to think. They denied the myth, but preserved the mystery. And that silence mattered. Because the moment you explain something like the dark side of the moon, it loses power. The illusion collapses. Pink Floyd understood that. By refusing to over-explain, they allowed every interpretation to survive. Every theory, every ritual, every personal meaning attached to the music. The album didn't need defending. It was already doing its job. The longer the band stayed quiet, the larger the legend grew. And slowly, something incredible happened. The Dark Side of the Moon stopped being just an album. It became a psychological mirror reflecting whatever the listener brought into it. Which leads to the final truth. Because the greatest trick Pink Floyd ever pulled was still waiting to be revealed. Before anyone even heard a note, The Dark Side of the Moon was already telling a story. The cover was impossibly simple. A beam of white light passing through a prism, splitting into color. No band name, No album title, no explanation. It looked scientific, precise, intelligent. And that was the point. The prism suggested physics, logic, hidden rules. It made the album feel like an experiment, something that could be studied, decoded, understood if you look closely enough. That single image trained the listener before the needle ever dropped. This wasn't just music. This was a system. The artwork reinforced everything the album was already doing sonically. Light turning into color, sound turning into meaning, order breaking into chaos. People didn't just listen to Dark Side, they examined it. And because the band offered no instructions, the audience filled the silence with theories. The cover didn't explain itself, it invited interpretation. That's why the album felt important in a way few records ever had. It looked like it knew something. And when something looks like a code, people assume it can be cracked. But the prism wasn't hiding answers. It was setting expectations. Expectations that made the illusion stronger and harder to escape. Here's the truth most people never consider. Pink Floyd didn't hide a movie inside the Dark Side of the Moon. They hid a mechanism. The album was designed to trigger searching. Everything about it encourages interpretation without offering resolution. The themes are universal, the sounds are suggestive, the voices are incomplete, the imagery is symbolic but unspecific. There is no final explanation because the album doesn't want one. Instead, it rewards curiosity. Every listener becomes part of the process, projecting meaning, drawing connections, building theories. And because those interpretations come from within, they feel personal, convincing, real. That's why the Wizard of Oz sync feels so powerful. It's not that the album matches the film, it's that the album matches expectation. Once you believe there's a secret, your mind does the rest. Pink Floyd didn't deceive the world with lies. They did it with restraint. They gave just enough information to activate the imagination and then step back. The listener finished the work. That's the genius. The album doesn't age because it never resolves. Each generation finds something new to decode, not because the answers change, but because the questions do. So how did the Dark Side of the Moon fool the world? By never forcing belief. No instructions. No confirmations. No secrets revealed. Just an experience so carefully constructed that millions of people felt there had to be more beneath the surface. And the world wanted that to be true. People wanted the album to be mystical, to be deeper than sound, to be something you could unlock if you listened hard enough. Pink Floyd didn't correct that desire. They trusted it. That's why the myths survived denial. Why theories outlived explanations. Why debates continue decades later. Because the album isn't about answers. It's about perception. And perception is powerful. In the end, the world wasn't tricked into believing the Dark Side of the Moon hid secrets. It chose to believe. And that choice, repeated by millions of listeners, turned one album into a living legend. Not because of what Pink Floyd hid, but because of what they never explained. The Dark Side of the Moon never needed to hide a secret message. The real illusion was far more elegant. Pink Floyd created an album that invites the listener to search, to question, to interpret, to project meaning where none is ever fully confirmed. That's why the Wizard of Oz myth refuses to disappear. That's why the voices, the sounds, the silence still feel loaded with intention. Not because there's a final answer waiting to be uncovered, but because the album was never meant to give one. The world wasn't fooled by deception. It was fooled by curiosity. And once curiosity takes hold, it becomes part of the art itself. That's the genius of the Dark Side of the Moon. If this story made you rethink the album, or if you've ever felt like there was something hidden inside it, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think it was coincidence or design? And if you want more stories like this, the ones hiding between sound, myth, and psychology, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay with us. Because some illusions don't disappear when they're explained. They get stronger.